102. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is David Bennett. I'm the Curator of Maritime History. And today we're going to be discussing forgotten boats of the Albemarle Sound. These are really two fishing boats that we're going to be talking about today. The one on the top is the pound net boat, which was small sailboat used in the pound net fishery on the western end of the Albemarle. And then we have the steam flats used in the seine net fishery. And these two boats were in the late 19th century were really iconic for this large, valuable fishery in the Albemarle. And unfortunately, since those fisheries changed and technology changed, those boats went away and they became less iconic and more forgotten, especially the pound net boat. So the area of the state that we're talking about is the Albemarle Sound in the northeastern part of the state. It's a large, mostly brackish water estuary, one of the largest estuaries in North Carolina. Is home to some of the largest, or to some of the earliest settlements in North Carolina, and to some of the largest commercial fishing operations in the state. It's bordered by 9 different counties, and there's numerous rivers and creeks that feed into it, the largest of which are the Alligator, Chowan, Pasquotank, Perquimans, Roanoke, and Scuppernong rivers. And of course, there are others as well. Why is this not advancing? All right, so here's a better view of the western end of the Albemarle Sound. And here's a better view of the eastern. And we're primarily going to be talking about the western part of the Albemarle Sound, but we'll talk a little bit about the northern part of Croatan Sound as well, because that area is relevant to the talk. So the fish that these fishermen were primarily going after was the shad, which was really valuable, especially when it was caught fresh and it was put on ice and shipped up north to markets in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where it fetched the highest prices. And then there's also herring, which was a major food fish in North Carolina. It was mostly salted and then sold locally in North Carolina as well as in Virginia. So a quick sort of condensed timeline of shad and herring fishing on the Albemarle Sound in that region. In the 1740s, you had John Campbell and Richard Brownrigg established the first known seine fishery on the Chowan River. And for almost a century, the seine fisheries continued to stay on the rivers because it was thought that the sound was too rough and dangerous to safely fish on. But it was in the early 1800s that Josiah Collins established a seine fishery in Edenton Bay. And Edenton Bay is technically part of the Albemarle Sound, but it's more sheltered, protected water. Then in 1814, Sandy Point fishery was first established on the Albemarle Sound, and it was a really exposed area on the Sound. So the first of its kind. And then in 1869, Peter Warren applied steam power to the windlasses of these seine fisheries. These windlasses would wind in the ropes that would pull the nets to shore with all the fish. And then John Hettrick that same year introduced the pound net to North Carolina. In 1879, Peter Warren built the first steam flat for use in the seine fishery on the Albemarle Sound. And that sort of brings us up to speed. So first off, we're going to talk about the steam flat, which was used around from 1879 to about 1917 in the Albemarle Sound. So there's just a better image to give you sort of an idea of what it was like. Sort of a good analogy for this boat is sort of like a large flatbed truck or tractor that was just taking huge amounts of net out into the sound and paying it out behind the boat, and then and also the ropes or the warps that were attached to them, and then they would and then the windlasses on shore would wind those in these nets and bring them into the beach. So the fish were never actually that were caught were never loaded onto these boats. And then here's an idea of what some of these nets looked like. They were up to a mile in length, sometimes more. And prior to these steam flats, large flat bottom rowboats were used called bateau. They're called bateaus, and they typically had 10 men rowing each one. There's 1 man per oar. And here's another image of men bringing the seine into shore with these boats. And this right here is probably one of the most accurate drawings of a bateau used in the seine fishery. So they're large boats with tons of net on them, large oars. So it was a big ordeal, very labor-intensive work. And these fishermen were working 24 hours a day, 6 days a week for about 3 months out of the year. So back to the steam flats, we don't really know a whole lot about the design and construction of them. There is some oral history that tells us how these boats were built. They were built right side up as opposed to upside down. They're flat bottom boats, and a lot of smaller flat bottom boats in North Carolina were typically built upside down, but these were built right side up, and they're also built on skids. And so probably what these skids were for is if these boats scraped along the bottom of the sound, that it wouldn't really damage the hull too much. The Albemarle is really is quite shallow. So there's also planked fore and aft. So the bottom planks are running from stem to stern on these boats. Once you had the bottom established, then the side planking was put onto these boats, and they're either slab-sided, so there's only maybe a couple of side planks for each side that were running the length of the boat, or they would have lap strake, so you would have overlapping planks on the sides of the boat. They were also decked at the very end. And then the materials that were used for the construction of these boats consisted of Atlantic white cedar or cypress for the hull, depending on what was available at the time. And then the frames for the boat were made out of oak, and then the decks were usually made out of pine. And here's one sort of description of these boats from the late 19th century. It says, "None of you know what a fishery flat is. I'll try to enlighten you. It's a cross between a vertical sawmill without the saw and a boiler afloat without the proper hold of a steamer. Some of them have no rudders and back square upon the beach to take in the seine, and then shoot it by running it out over the stern." So it's a sort of trying to, this writer was trying to explain what these boats look like without really having a photo or an image of one for the reader, and actually tells us some nice details, particularly about the boiler, sort of comparing it to a vertical sawmill, which suggests that it was a vertical boiler, which would make sense because they're really typical with small steamboats of that time period, primarily because they're compact. They wouldn't have taken up a whole lot of room on the vessel. And you really need that extra room for all the nets and ropes. And then they also built up steam quickly, so you could get underway in a short amount of time, which was important. And then they're also low pressure, as opposed to a high pressure boiler. And this would have been fairly important because if you were to have an accident and the boiler was to blow up, it would be devastating, but not quite as devastating as a high pressure boiler. And then we also have, there's one image right here that shows a vertical low pressure boiler being used on a steam flat. And then the steering, it's a bit interesting. Some of the photos of these boats show a ship's wheel, which would suggest that they're manipulating a rudder. However, a lot of the photos don't show ship's wheels, and as that one sort of description I read earlier mentioned, they might not have all of them had rudders. So in that case, what might have happened is for some of these boats, they might have been able to manipulate the speed at which the two paddle wheels went. So you could reduce the speed of one wheel while increasing the speed of another one to maneuver the boat. Another means of maneuvering these boats was by using sweeps. They would reduce the speed of the boat, and then they would place these sweeps in the water, and it would cause drag, and it would provide a pivot point for these boats so they could make drastic course changes while going at low speeds. And these boats were slow and they were cumbersome, so sometimes they did need special help. And then here's another photo with with a sweep. This looks different, just a large oar. And then the man who first built these boats, the original creator was Captain Peter M. Warren, who lived from 1814 to 1889. He was a waterman, professional waterman. He was a fisherman, and he was also in boat transportation out of Edenton. And he's credited with a number of sort of quote unquote maritime inventions, but he only received a patent for one, and that was in 1869, applying steam power to the windlasses for these seine fisheries. So that's the only patent he ever received. And then in 1879, he built the first steam flat on the Albemarle Sound used in the seine fisheries. Some of the sources suggest that the idea for the steam flat might not have been his idea originally, but that of his friend Wiley Ray, who was from Edenton. Ray was a carpenter, and apparently the two of them worked closely with one another. And I believe he passed away before the first steam flat was ever created. So it might have been his idea, but Warren definitely executed the idea. So the steam flat's main voyage took place in 1879 at Drummond's Point fishery near the Yopim River in Chowan County. And the fishery was originally owned by J.L. Smith of Long Island, New York. It's from a very wealthy New York family. And this right here is Drummond Point, east of Edenton. So when Peter Warren died in 1889, the fishermen of the region decided that they're going to try and get together and raise money to have a big monument or memorial dedicated to Peter Warren in downtown Edenton. They talked about it for quite some time. Unfortunately, they're never able to raise enough money. However, in 1896, they did erect a new headstone for Peter Warren. And it's hard to read it in this photo, but if we click over here to the slide, it says, "In memory of Captain Peter M. Warren, who died in June 1889, aged 73 years, an honest man, full of good works, a lifelong seine fisherman, and the author of all its improvements. This stone is erected in grateful remembrance by his brother fishermen." So what was the significance of these steam flats used in the seine fishery? Well, it increased efficiency. For instance, crew size. The steam flats really only needed 5 men to operate on the Sound, whereas a bateau needed 10 to 12 men to row them. They're able to also shoot the seine faster. So a steam flat could do it 6 times a day, whereas a bateau could only do it 4 times. So you could conceivably catch more fish with a steam flat. And so we're going to get into how these flats actually work. So they'd start off on the beach like so, getting the nets and the ropes loaded on to 2 flats. Then before they went out into the sound, you'd have the lead boat would go bow first, and then the steam flat that followed behind it would go stern first. And this is because the lead boat carried half the net, and then the boat that followed going stern first had the other half. And these nets, of course, are attached, and they're just trying to make it easier to get out there without, I guess, tangling up the net or messing it up. And so they'd start off stern to stern, headed out to a point in the sound called the center bush. And this is right here. This would be where the Avoca fishery was located in Bertie County. Over here, we have the Albemarle Sound, and then we have the Chowan River to the northwest. And then they would head out to the center bush. And the center bush was literally a pole sunk into the bottom of the sound with a bush tied to it. And also they could see it easily from shore. And this pre-designated point was about 1 mile to 1.5 miles offshore. From that point, these boats would go their separate ways. The land end boat, this boat over here would swoop back to shore, paying out its net. And then the sea end boat would travel parallel to the shore, paying out its net. All the while, the shad and the herring were swimming in towards the Chowan River, because the shad and the herring, they spend most of their life in the ocean and salt water. And then during the spawning season, usually March to May, they would come into the fresher waters of North Carolina, go up and spawn into the rivers. So they're headed for the Chowan, and they're running into this fence of a net that's in their way. And so here we have men working a net. And then you have the sea end boat come back around to shore, and the shad and the herring are completely encircled and they cut off. And then the ropes are fed into the windlasses on shore, and the steam powered windlasses would wind the ropes in and pull the net into the beach. And this is what it looks like when the net was landed with all the fish. All the men and women would help pull it in into this fish house. And this place here on the beach where they're landing the net is called the battery. And then here's an image of what it looked like with the fish landed there. I have a steam flat in the background. And then you had these smaller boats that were associated with these seine fisheries. These are punts. They're small flat bottom boats. And what would happen is after they had wound these, the windlasses had wound up the ropes and the nets had been landed, you had these huge coils of rope that had to be returned to the steam flats. And these windlasses are hundreds of yards away from where the net is actually landed. And so you have hundreds of pounds of rope and you can't carry them back down to the steam flat very easily. So they'd load them up on these boats, and then you'd have 1 or 2 guys with poles. They'd be pulling these little boats back to the steam flats, and they would load the ropes back onto these boats. They also used lanterns with these steam flats, as well as with the windlasses on shore, and they're used to signal at night, as well as to provide illumination on the decks of these boats at night. But they could motion side to side to say slow down to the windlasses on shore, saying, slow down, don't pull these nets in quite as fast. And then they could move their lanterns up and down and say stop pulling in the net. And then they could move it in a circular movement, say speed up. And then likewise, the people on shore could make these same sort of signals and directions to the steam flats. And here's an image. We have some lanterns that have been used just for that, as well as for illumination. And then occasionally, sometimes these steam flats were used to deliver boxes of fish to Edenton, where they would be put on a train and sent up to New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore and other locations. And this is actually from Avoca, and Avoca wasn't too far away from Edenton. And then, so I've done a lot of research where I've tried to catalog as many of these vessels as possible. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but here they are, their names, where they're built, and their dimensions. And sometimes I was able to find the horsepower for these vessels, and they're typically very low horsepower, so they would have moved pretty slowly through the water. Voca and Bull Pond are in Bertie County. Coleraine is in Bertie County. Drummond Point is in Chowan. And Edenton, of course, is in Chowan County. Elizabeth City is in Pasquotank County. And then the Lydia, the Croatan, and the Charles are actually interesting boats because they were actually used in Croatan Sound in Dare County. Dare County had one steam seine fishery, but it was owned by an Edenton resident. And then the Camille was also operated on Croatan Sound, and the Camille was unusual in the way it was built and the way it looks. It's a lot fancier. And it's a lot better looking than the other steam flats that were being used in that region of the state. And then here's an advertisement that I found that Dr. William Capehart paid for at the Avoca fishery. He was trying to sell his steam flat so he could build a larger one and upgrade. And then here are the locations where these vessels were built. We had one built at Manteo in Dare County, then Elizabeth City, Pasquotank County. Most of them were built in Bertie and Chowan counties. And then also most of these fisheries were located in Chowan and Bertie County, and you had one in Dare County. And then the crew composition. The crew was made up entirely of black watermen. These black watermen dominated this fishery, not only on these vessels, on these fishing vessels, but also on shore. You had black women who were processing the fish. So the sea captain was responsible for his crew and the equipment on the vessel, as well as navigation. And he was usually a strong, sort of tough guy. Sometimes he had to use sort of physical force to keep his crew in line. There's a lot of whiskey drinking going on because it was cold. They're fishing in a very cold time of year, and it was constantly wet, and they're just drinking them to try and stay warm. The engineer worked on the boiler, and he occupied sort of a position of respectability within the crew because he had a more technical skill. Not anyone could do it. And there's two engineers for each boat. One would be on duty working on the boat, while the other one was off duty and sleeping on shore, waiting his turn to work on one of these boats. Again, these boats are running 24 hours a day. And the rest of the crew would work the seine and the warps. And the warps are just these heavy ropes that are attached. These nets are used to tow the nets back to shore. I've only really been able to find the name of one of these crew members, and that's Lawrence Binbury, who is the general manager of Avoca Steam Flats and Fishing Hands. He was originally born into slavery in Chowan County. He was owned by the Binbury family. And after the Civil War ended, of course, he was a free man, and he went to work for Dr. William Capehart at the Avoca fishery. from 1866 to 1894. His career was ended by a stroke in 1894, and he unfortunately died in 1896. But we actually know quite a bit about his life because when he passed away, Dr. Capehart wrote this huge obituary for the man. And his obituary wasn't only published in North Carolina, but it was also published all the way up in Virginia. And just by the way that the obituary is written, you could tell that he really cared a lot about this man. And Dr. Capehart, the title of the obituary for Lawrence Binbury was Obituary Tribute to a True Man, published in the Weekly Economist originally, which is came out of Elizabeth City. And he wrote, "For 29 years, Lawrence has been ready and glad to serve me at any moment, and I believe him to have been one of the most honest, considerate, and affectionate men I ever knew." And so we actually know more about the character of Lawrence Binbury, more so than we actually do about his vocation as a waterman. So how did people actually get into this business? How do you get into working a steam flat or even working in this fishery? And people started off when they were children. It was sort of a paid internship, if you will, so on the job training. You'd have these young boys who they would start off by stoking the boiler furnaces, learning how these sort of boilers work from the engineers. They'd also, between the holes, sometimes they're sorting the fish and helping clean them and pack them up. And as they got older, they would take on additional responsibilities and learn different skills. And by the time they're in their late teens, they're actually able to work as full-time and wage-earning employees. But while they're kids, they're being paid in fish, usually herring and perch, that they would take home, and they would have a nice meal for their families. And then we actually have this one photo right here that actually shows a child on a steam flat, just hanging out. And these boats weren't safe to work on. I haven't found any record of a boiler exploding. However, plenty of drownings. For instance, Alan Cabris fell off seine flat at Skinner's Point Fishery on the 23rd of April in 1888. His body was not recovered until May 1st, 1888, when they were pulling in a seine. Now, these boats sort of went out of style. The seine fisheries sort of diminished largely due to the rise of the pound net in this region of North Carolina. So these black dots indicate where these seine fisheries are, and this map is from 1906. And so really on the Sound, there's only 3 in 1906. Most of them are down here on the Roanoke River. But all these things that look like little trees or pipe cleaners coming off the shore, these are all pound nets. And so the pound nets were cheaper and much more efficient to use than seines. And so they really displaced the seine net fishery. And then World War I came. And by the time United States joined World War I, the only seine fishery on the Albemarle Sound was Avoca. And all the men working it went off to war. While the war was going on, there was no one there to tend to the boats, and the boats started to rot. And by the time the war ended and people started coming back to Avoca, these boats couldn't be used anymore. And rather than build new steam flats, they started to rely on a different type of boat, which is the gasoline-powered motorboat. They're using these sort of V-bottom boats to tow these small pontoons that had the nets. The fishery was operated in pretty much the same way as they were with the steam flats, but just with fewer men and just on a sort of smaller basis. But it didn't last for very long. It ultimately ended in the 1930s. And there's very few archaeological remains of the steam flats. In 1987, the North Carolina Underwater Archaeology Branch found remains in Bertie County. They're only briefly examined because they weren't really the boats that they were looking for. And the hulls were so heavily deteriorated that there wasn't really that much to record. All that was really left was the hardware associated with the paddle wheels. And so now we're on the Pownet boat, which we really don't know a whole lot about, unfortunately. The earliest appearance of them in photographs is in 1881, and they're probably used up until 1915. And so just some quick information on Pownet. So this is sort of what one looked like underwater. In North Carolina, the Pownet went by different names. It was initially called a Dutch net because the men who introduced it to North Carolina were of Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. It is also called a pod net, a pond net, and essentially works is you have the lead, which sort of functions as a fence that the fish will collide with this part of the net, and they'll try and get around it, which will then lead them into a section called the heart, and then the heart will direct them into a funnel, and the funnel will direct them into the pound right here. And once they're in the pound, there's no getting out for them until the fishermen come and fish them out, usually with sort of a dip net. So the man who introduced the pound net to North Carolina was John Hettrick, who was a Civil War veteran from Pennsylvania. He lived part of his life in Ohio, where he learned how to fish pound nets on Lake Erie. He moved to Chowan County in 1869. And he bought Snow Hill Farm in Chowan County, and he started fishing pound nets at Sandy Point. So he owned a pound net fishery, but he also owned a farm and a lumber mill, and he even had a bakery in Edenton. In 1878, his brother William Hettrick, who had been living in Ohio, came down to fish with John. And he primarily fished in both Washington and Chowan counties. He became extremely successful as an entrepreneur, not only in fishing and farming, but also in real estate, and he owned multiple retail businesses in Edenton. And so again, just really showing how important these pound nets became with this 1906 map. 1869, 1870, there's only one pound net in North Carolina. By 1906, there are hundreds that went well beyond the Albemarle Sound. What's interesting about the pound net boat is that it's not native at all to Eastern North Carolina. In fact, is originally from Lake Erie. We don't know exactly who introduced the boat to North Carolina. It's possible that it could have been William Hettrick, but we don't know for sure. The boat certainly was popular when John and William were fishing pound nets up on Lake Erie. So there's Lake Erie, and then we have the Albemarle Sound, 1,000 miles away from one another. So the question is, what's this boat doing here? Michael Alford, who's one of my predecessors, wrote, the question the photo raises is, what was this boat doing here? Does it represent an attempt to introduce a new type, as in the case of the Sharpie, some 20 years earlier? And what he was talking about was the Connecticut Sharpie, which was introduced to North Carolina in 1876. But this is the photo that he's actually referring to of the pound net boat, which is taken in about 1895. Now, Howard Chappell, who is this great maritime historian and naval architect, he was also the curator of the National Watercraft Collection at the Smithsonian, wrote a little bit about the pound net boat in North Carolina, and he didn't really think it was that big of a deal. He didn't think there are that many boats, but even Chappell admitted that by the time he was writing about these boats, that they had gone completely extinct, even in the Great Lakes region. And I sort of beg to differ with Chappell's opinion on them really not being that popular in North Carolina, and I'll explain why. So here we have the masthead for the fisherman and the farmer, which was the main newspaper out of Edenton in the late 19th century. If you zoom in on it, you have two pound net boats next to pound nets being fished in the Sound. And the pound net boat has a very distinct sail plan, very distinct rig, which is unique to its boat type. So these are absolutely definitely pound net boats. And then on the opposite side, you actually have two steam flats pulling in a seine. And so what's going on with this is that they're using these icons of the steam flats and the pound net boats to show off the wealth and prosperity of Chowan County in the late 19th century. And why would you show these boats off, particularly the pound net boats, if they're not common and if they're not important to the fishery? Then in 1884, there's something called the North Carolina State Exhibition, which was this giant event to promote agriculture and industry in North Carolina. And there was a booth for the fisheries at this exhibition where they showed off boat models. And some of the boat models they showed off was the pound net boat from the Albemarle Sound and the steam flat used in the seine fishery, as well as the core sound sharpie. Then in 1893, North Carolina had some booths at the Chicago World Fair. Again, they showed off models of the pound net boat and the steam flat and the core sound sharpie. So obviously these boats are really important to the fisheries of North Carolina. If they're showing this off at their fisheries booth, they're showing off these boats to the whole world essentially. And then we also have newspaper ads. For instance, there's this lost boat, and they mention it being a pound net fishing boat. It's from 1884. Then there's another ad for a lost Dutch net boat, which is again a pound net boat, 1893. Then I like this one quite a bit because it's an ad for sale, 2 fine canoe boats, a pontoon, as well as Dutch net boats. So this one, there's actually distinction between the type of boats that are actually being used. And then again, another for sale, a Dutch net boat or a pound net boat, along with 10 Dutch nets or pound nets, 1897. All in the Edenton area. Then we also have photos. So these are the earliest photos that we have from 1881, taken by the U.S. Fish Commission, which was at the time examining the pound net fisheries and seine net fisheries of the Albemarle Sound and its tributaries. And these are taken in Edenton. And this one's a bit unusual because it shows lap strake, sort of what looks like maybe a little bit of a rounded hull, maybe a soft chine to the boat. This is what they look like on the inside. And then in the 1890s, so these probably taken around the mid-1890s by H.H. Brimley, who was working for the state of North Carolina to record the commercial fishing operations of the state. So we have photos that span roughly 2 decades where these boats are showing up, as well as 2 decades worth of newspaper ads and instances where models of these boats are being shown off. So they seem to be quite common, at least in my opinion. There's also so the characteristics of these boats are they ranged in length from 24 to 42 feet, but usually the average is around 35 or 36, and they're really sort of unusually wide. They tend to have been around 10.5 feet in width, usually if they're about 36 or 35 feet in length. They're distant relatives of the Connecticut sharpie, but they're wider and they're much heavier and they're more rugged vessels. And they would have to be because Lake Erie could get really rough and violent and dangerous. Some more characteristics: open flat bottom boats, generally speaking. Occasionally, you'd see some sort of rounded bottoms on these vessels. They could be carvel or lap strike planking. So lap strike planking is where the side planks overlap one another, and carvel is when they're planked edge to edge. They're sharp bows with flare, had a wide transom, large, thick centerboard, 2 thwarts, 2 bulkheads, and 2 masts. And the masts were raked. And as I mentioned before, the sail plan was very unique. Chappelle even had difficulty characterizing them. They sort of looked like sort of a gaff rig right here, but also unlike most gaff sails, there's this sort of top sail going on here. So Chappelle described it as being sort of a combination of a gaff and leg of mutton. And they're unstayed but flexible masts that are raked. The foremast is stepped really close to the stem right here. This shows you again where the foremast would have been stepped. And then the main mast is at the after thwart, farther back in the boat. The crew size is usually around 2 to 3 men. Sometimes you see 4 men in pictures of these boats. Another interesting feature with these boats is the presence of a footboard, which is this board that ran fore and aft in these boats. You don't see these features in a lot of North Carolina fishing boats, but what they're there for probably is so that men could walk up and down the boat without stepping on fish in the hold. And the gear was kept between the 2 bulkheads, right around the centerboard trunk. So in this area, the fish and the gear would have been here. And then, of course, this photo shows a bulkhead and fish being kept in front of it. And so just to give you a better idea of just how important and how numerous the boats were that are involved in this fishery, in 1896 for the Albemarle and Croton Sounds, you had over 600-pound nets, nearly 230 men working, and 175 boats. And from official records, that there were boat builders from that period that were working to prop up this industry, and they're making about $1 to $2 a day, so about $30 to $60 a day in our money. There's tens of thousands of dollars in equipment and fish being landed, which in 2020 would have been millions of dollars. And then these pound nets and these boats also would have opened up sort of a different class of individual and fishermen. Both the boats and the nets were pretty cheap, and so a lot of different people could fish them. So the steam flat fisheries, those were or the seine fisheries were dominated by wealthy landed individuals, or the gentry of that part of the state, whereas the pound nets were used by sort of the average man. A lot of merchants in Edenton got into the business. For instance, J. Woodard, he owned 3 pound nets and 3 boats that fished them, and on average, he was shipping 400 to 500 boxes of fish per year, which is just a tremendous amount for 3 nets and 3 boats. It is possible that these pound net boats could have been edged out by the Shad Boat. The Shad Boat was, of course, originally built in the 1870s in the Croton Sound area in Dare County. And there were 2 classes of Shad boats. You had the stake boat, which carried the stakes and the nets that would have gone to set up the pound nets. And you also had your pound net boat, which is a little bit smaller, that actually would have gone inside the pound and got the fish. But I'm not even sure how far west into the Albemarle that these boats would have gone. We do know that the farthest west the shad boats were built in North Carolina was in Terrell County in Columbia, North Carolina. I'm not sure how, again, not sure how far west they went. But I think that the Pownet boats hung on up until around 1915 in the western part of the Albemarle around Edenton because of accounts like this from William Leary writing in 1915 said the boats used are flat bottomed, so they can easily cross the line at the top of the heart, pound or pod. And this is so they could go into the pound to collect the fish. And then another Scott Boyce wrote, it is estimated that on average, there was one boat to 3 nets. At this time, they were rigged with sail, hence more were required than when using gas. Again, every fisherman had his own boat, and some of them had only 1 or 2 nets. So unfortunately, with the pound net fishery, when people were writing about boats, they were very vague. And so we only have these, little snapshots of what was going on. And these weren't really boat people who were writing about them, but we do know that we've got flat bottom sailboats that are being used to fish these pound nets, and shad boats have rounded or V bottom. And so there doesn't sound like they're talking about shad boats, but rather more like something like the pound net boat or some other flat bottom sailing skiff. And then by 1915, there was a transition from sail to gas power with boats that are involved in this fishery. The gas-powered boats could fish more nets in a day. They could cover a greater distance. They could make it back to shore in a timely manner. They didn't have to worry about fish spoiling as much, and they could venture out into rougher weather more often. And these boats weren't hindered by the wind or the conditions or the lack there of wind. They could just go any way they wanted. Where sailboats are really dependent on the presence of wind or even the direction of wind. And this gave rise to what is called the herring boat, which you primarily find in the western Albemarle and on the Chowan and the Roanoke rivers associated with the pound net fishery. And you really start seeing more of these boats in the 20s and 30s and moving forward from there. And unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about these boats. However, a number of these boats still exist, and they really do need to be studied. And that brings this presentation to an end. I'm just going to slowly go through my citations for y'all.
And you do have a question on Facebook.
Okay.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned 3 foot deep. Was that the draft or the depth of the hole?
So that was the depth. So when I mentioned when I mentioned boats being 3 feet deep, that was the depth of the boat rather than the draft. Yeah, so I didn't make that clear. Anything else?
Yes. That's the only question.
Okay.
But I do want us to mention Michelle's program on the 25th about archaeological conservation.
Okay. So on the 25th of this month, I have a coworker, Michelle, who runs the conservation lab here at the Maritime Museum in Beaufort. She's doing a presentation, and what was the title of that again?
Diffusion and desalination and archaeological conservation.
So, yeah.
You need to say it louder.
Diffusion and desalination in archaeological conservation. Okay. So she's doing a presentation on conservation and desalinating things that have been submerged in salt water for some time. If there's any more questions for my talk, I'm going to hang around for a little while. I do have another talk next month that will focus more on the seine fisheries. of the Albemarle Sound and its tributaries, just kind of gone more into the history and more the ins and outs of how the seine net fisheries worked up there, because they're really massive and huge, and due to overfishing and changes in technology, they're just not around anymore.
You mentioned that these fishermen were out there in cold weather.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the boiler also served another purpose in that of thawing them out, since they were in the water a lot.
It could have, it definitely would have kept the engineer and his assistant warm. But I don't know. It's, there's water was constantly splashing up. Those guys were getting into the water, especially when the net was being landed. About 50 yards from shore, I think, is when there's a lot of guys would get off the boat and start working the net. They would have to get in the water and do something called footing the net once it got close to shore, where they were actually stepping on the net to hold the lead line down to the bottom of the sound. And so that would have been really cold water, given that they started doing that in March. So, and with the next presentation I do next month, where I'll be talking about that stuff, I'll be talking more about things like that.
You mentioned that these fish were going to spawn, so I'm assuming they were full of eggs at that time. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the female where the like the roe shad and the roe herring were, and that was another valuable product. So it wasn't always just the meat of the fish. They'd cut the roe herring open and the shad herring, and they'd scoop out the eggs as well, and the eggs were sold. There's really valuable, and also
Shad roe is great with scrambled eggs.
Yeah, well, that's how people ate it. A lot of people, it's sort of like caviar. And yeah, it was quite a popular food.
Richard here. Just a notice to the persistence of the shad and how far they'll go upstream. When we were little, we would go fishing for shad in Lassiter Mill in Raleigh. Well, Lassiter Mill was one of the dams before Umstead Park on Crabtree Creek, which is a tributary of the Neuse River. And you used to have to snag them, but they're really good eating and a high dollar item in the sushi bar.
Yeah, the shad and the herring used to go really far up the rivers and creeks and streams of North Carolina. In the colonial era, they went all the way up to sort of they would go past Raleigh. They'd go up to like the Winston-Salem's or Greensboro area. They could be found in the creeks up in the rivers up there. Unfortunately, those fish, particularly the shad, are really sensitive to pollution. They started recognizing that really early on with runoff from farms, and they're recognizing that as early as the late 18th, early 19th century, because when the water was becoming cloudy after rain with dirt and mud and runoff from fertilizer, the fish wouldn't want to go past it. And so over time, as there's more and more pollution in the rivers, the shad wouldn't venture as far up. There's a big problem with paper mills in North Carolina on the Neuse and on the Roanoke and the Chowan rivers.
Just another note on the herring. I won't name the seafood market in New Bern, but they were advertising within the last year fresh herring.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, well, I thought the herring fishery was closed down. And then they said, oh, well, they're frozen.
Yeah, a lot of the herring that are being sold in North Carolina are coming from South Carolina. They're coming from elsewhere.
Thank you, David. Very interesting presentation.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for listening in.
Man, great job.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully over time, I'll learn more about these different boats. And in the future, I'll have more to report on. Is there any other questions? Nothing? Okay. Well, I think that does it for today. Thank you all for tuning in and listening.